So I'm Cadell Walker. I'm the Director of Advancement. Thank you all for joining us. This is our last and final series of our Bridging the Nature Gap Zoom. So we have two annual campaigns, one we do in the fall and one we do in the spring. Normally with those campaigns we do in-person events, but because of COVID, we haven't been able to do that. So we've been doing Zoom series to highlight the topics for these campaigns. These campaigns are done to help raise annual funds for Bernheim to support our work that we do. For some of you, you may know that we were founded by Isaac Wolf Bernheim in 1929. When we were founded by Mr. Bernheim, he was a thought leader for his time, especially in 1929. When he founded Bernheim, he said that Bernheim would be for all people, regardless of race, creed, or economic status. Mr. Bernheim himself was a Jewish German immigrant when he came to the United States, and he really he was a peddler when he came here and really worked his way up. And Bernheim was his American dream and giving back to the people. So at Bernheim, we really do try to honor Mr. Bernheim's vision for the forest. He wrote a letter to the trustees, and we read it every year at our board meeting. Everyone passes it around and reads a piece of it. So it's very important to us that we are true to what Mr. Bernheim wanted for the forest. And so we have always tried to be a diverse forest and a welcoming place, all the way from the biodiversity of our land to the diversity of our programs and the diversity of our visitors. And so Bridging the Nature Gap is about highlighting that diversity and the great work that Bernheim is doing in that arena. So our goal for that campaign is to raise $100,000. I'm excited to say we have raised $72,000, and we hope to raise all of that goal by the end of December 31st. So if you're so inclined to support that work, it's bernheim.org/bridge is the website where you can go to learn more about the campaign, learn more about our work in that area, and then also support our campaign goal. So now I'll turn it over to Claude.
Well, thank you, Cadell. Thanks everybody for being here this evening. I know that it eats into your evening, but we have a great speaker this evening, so I'm delighted to here. I see some familiar faces out there, some people that are actually engaged in the work of diversity and equity, and I appreciate you. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, a little bit of a background about some of the things that's going on at Bernheim in terms of bridging the nature gap. As Cadell said, all the way back to our founder, who said that we should be a place for all people. And it's messy, that work is perfect, but that work is also ongoing. So regardless of race, creed, or economic status is kind of the gold standard for us in what we do. So that was stated in 1920. That was not what was going on in 1920. In fact, it was the 30s and the 40s and the 50s that state parks and national parks were still developing places for whites only. And in reality, that work continues. And I want to thank, I see Tom Block. Tom Block sent, he's the great grandson of Isaac W. Bernheim. He's on. He sent an article from CNN just yesterday that talked about this. So this is current work that's going on. To address the nature divide is imperfect and messy, as I mentioned, but we're doing some of that work, and I want to let you know some of that. In 2019, that's when we actually first met this evening's speaker, Dr. Corliss Outley. We brought her into town for an urban play conference where we talked about the difference in the ability of different groups of people to be able to freely engage with the environment, to go outside and play. So that work was funded by the Lift Alive Foundation. They helped us do some of the work to bring that conference into town. Over the past several years, we've received funding from PNC Bank, and they have allowed us to engage with very specific audiences, to either engage them where they are in their communities or to bring them to Bernheim. So we've worked with Play Cousins Collective, Bridge Kids International, the Backside Learning Center, Community Shield, and a number of other organizations. And we're beginning to develop the relationships that will allow us to move this work forward. This past year, with generous support from the Jewish Heritage Fund for Excellence, we've been working on the Louisville Rites of Passage program, which is a program for Black youth in Louisville, ages 15 through 18. And we're in the throes of designing and building out that program even as we speak. And it's actually, Dr. Corliss Outley is engaged in that work as well, because we have contracted with Clemson University's RISE Center to do the evaluation work for that program. Dr. Corliss Outley is proud of her urban roots. She grew up in the Compton area of California, where she could look up and see the mountains, but those were mountains that were not exactly accessible to her for lots of different reasons. So she lived the nature divide that stems from structural racism that goes back to actually the founding of our country and through today. So she went on to pursue her education and eventually received her master's degree in forestry from Southern Illinois University. She was one of the small handful of Black women that was in the forestry program at Southern Illinois University. Then she went to Texas A&M, where she was the first Black female to get a PhD in natural resource management. So, Giga Maggie.
Yeah.
She now, prior to getting her master's degree, she worked for several years with U.S. Forest Service, where she could see firsthand this nature divide. So she began the work of dismantling that. So it's hard work because it's simultaneously dismantling and building.
Yes.
So that makes this work very tricky. She's now at the Clemson University's RISE Center, and that's REYSE, and that stands for Race, Ethnicity, Youth, and Social Equity. And it's a collaboratory. And it was just a year ago that you launched that program. And I attended a Zoom opening for the RISE Center because Bernheim's partnership with Play Cousins and Bridge Kids is one of the first programs that the RISE Center was working on. So we feel honored about that. I want to end with the mission for the RISE Center, and then I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Corliss Outley. So the mission of the RISE Center is to improve the lives of racialized and ethnicized youth populations through innovation, community engagement, and knowledge exchange. So we're honored to be a part of that, a small part of that, and honored to have your wisdom this evening. So Dr. Corliss Outley, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Cadell, and thank you, Claude. To start, let me go ahead and start sharing my screen. Can everyone see that? All
Yep.
right. So I'd like to thank you so much for that great introduction, as well as this opportunity to take some time tonight to talk with you guys. So my whole presentation today is about recoloring the outdoors so that we can get a better understanding of the historical connection between Blacks and the outdoors, with a particular emphasis on Black youth. So let's start off with this lovely picture of my favorite two little girls, what's called the agreements. So a lot of what we'll discuss tonight may be emotionally or even intellectually challenging for a lot of you. I need you to understand that there may be some graphics or intense content that may bring up uncomfortable areas as we have our conversation. But I will do my best to make sure that this space is available where we can engage bravely, empathetically, but also thoughtfully. So what are my pointers for you tonight? Just breathe. We know this is a hard discussion. I will bring things up that you may not be familiar with. Please try to listen to understand. When there are opportunities to speak, because there will be, I want you to speak your own truth. Make sure that you assume positive intentions from other speakers and respect their viewpoint. And finally, just provide respectful comments and language at all times. So I am going to begin. Is everybody ready? All right, let's go. So I'm going to first talk about children in nature. Everyone here on this call has had this particular discussion. And we know the whole idea of children in nature really began to push off in 2008 with the publication of this book called Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louisville. He was able through this book to start a nationwide movement in trying to reconnect children with nature, because he felt that our children were suffering from what was called nature deficit disorder. Well, why was this even a big issue? Well, we know that when we think about the outdoors and children, that it comes with lots of benefits. Those benefits include everything from active awareness and nutrition of where food comes from, to them being more civil to each other, as well as increased creativity. We know that if kids spend time in the wild, they're more likely to have positive environmental attitudes, positive environmental behaviors later in adulthood. We also know that it had health benefits. Time in the outdoors were associated with lower levels of myopia. It was also decreases in things like ADHD and ADD, as well as stress. We also found that children who spent more time were actually more active. So they increased their physical activity, and that individual children that participated in environmental education programs actually scored better on reading, math, language, and even spelling. Those benefits were also found in 3 core areas: cognitive, emotional, and social. Cognitively, increased creativity, problem solving, self-discipline. Socially, by being in the outdoors, it actually led to outcomes such as cooperation, flexibility, self-awareness of individuals, as well as their connection to spiritual areas of life. And then finally, emotionally, stress reduction, reduce aggression, and actually increase happiness. So even though we had all of these benefits, Richard Louisville still found that kids weren't going outside. So what were the reasons? Well, the number one reason was parents were beginning to overschedule their young people. We were finding more and more young people were participating in youth sports or organized activities. Even though the obesity rate was actually increasing during that same time, but we still found that there was less time for just general unstructured play. There was also this fear of stranger danger. You guys remember those commercials? Stranger danger, and everybody had to stay away, and issues around safety, which were different during my day because I was a latchkey kid. You had a key around your neck and you just walked home and let yourself in. But this fear led to media overexposure. It led to the belief that all these kids were getting kidnapped. But we found out that it was overinflated, that actually the number has been stable over the past 15, 20 years. But regardless, more and more parents began placing restrictions on kids' outdoor play. Not only where they can play, who they can play with, and even the times of the day that they can play. There also began an increase on educational emphasis in technology. We were starting to use technology more within the school system. And despite that, we began to decrease things like music and arts, even though they showed an increase in test scores. And then Lou finally also pointed out fear of litigation. We started seeing cities making decisions regarding open spaces and playgrounds that actually limited unstructured play. They were taking out things like, remember the merry-go-round? And you used to swing it as fast as you could so you get dizzy. We don't have that anymore. They took out the monkey bars because of parents suing because of kids getting hurt. And then there became more restrictions on just youth programming. So as we began to see that this nature deficit disorder was actually increasing, trends started showing us that this wasn't just an isolated incident. We started seeing decreases in bicycle sales. We started seeing increases in the amount of time that kids spent watching TV, playing video games. Even the school systems began to decrease the number of opportunities for recess throughout the school day, as well as PE, physical education classes. So it resulted in kids having less free time in what they wanted to do. And even we were organizing our schools to where kids couldn't even bike and walk to school. They had to be dropped off by parents. And as schools started to increase in their participation enrollments, we started building new schools. And I don't know if you guys recognize, the majority of the new schools we're building don't have sidewalk access. They aren't necessarily directly in neighborhoods. They're on the outskirts of the neighborhoods, and kids are either dropped off by their parents or they're bused in. In a recent study that I did, this was one of the quotes I love using, where a fourth grader said, "I like to play indoors better because that's where all the electrical outlets are." This was the typical response of young people when it came to going outside or staying indoors. So tell me about your childhood. How did your family talk about play in the outdoors? Did you have opportunities to just go have fun? Let's take a few minutes to talk about it. What did you guys do? How many of you were latchkey kids, and did you still get to roam around outdoors? Feel free to put it in the chat box, anything you want to say, or even unmute yourself on the mic.
Yeah, played tennis, catchers, frozen catchers, hide and seek, caught lightning bugs.
Ding dong ditch. I still played that, if you guys remember that. You ring somebody's doorbell and you run during the summer. People talked about they can roam freely, lived on the end of a dead-end dirt road, so they got to play. A lot of us were latchkey kids, and you got to play after school every day. You guys remember you played outside until the lights came on. When those street lights came on, you were running because you had to be in the house, and you had to make sure you weren't too far. I was trying to explain, even when we were inside, the TV went off at 12, and they did the Pledge of Allegiance at the end, and the flag would wave. You guys remember that? And then all of a sudden it went, shh. They don't even understand that today. So Amy talked about playing at the creek. So all of that became important in our childhood. All of us can remember the bell for recess. We remembered playing. So it's a little different from what we may think of childhood today, but it's also different in terms of race. So let's take a few moments to talk about blacks and the outdoors. and what I call the trifecta. You see, when we think about Blacks in nature, especially around young children, the idea of race has distorted our perception, especially around their experience of play in the outdoors. Even though we're sitting here talking about all of the opportunities where we played, that isn't the case for a lot of our young people. And there are 3 reasons why. One, we need to understand historically what's happened with Black childhood. 2, we need to look at the historical relationship between Blacks as a racial group in nature. And then finally need to look at the contemporary racialized landscapes that we live in today. So let's start with our Black childhood. So what is childhood? So childhood could be understood as what children mean to a given society. We talk about childhood, but we need to understand that there are social political forces that inform and that are informed by the process of meaning making. So when we think about our childhood, it entails everything that goes on within a society for young people under a certain age. And that age is actually set by different cultures. Here in the US, it's usually 18. And that childhood entails games that children can play, the things they used to play with, and it's tied to culture and parental practices. But we see childhood as a time where they use play to practice the skills that are needed for them to become adults. And so it serves an important role in today's society. But we have come to realize that even though we have all this evidence about the importance of childhood, that there are differences and benefits of play during childhood. And that especially for Black children, that what happens during childhood for them looks very differently in the US society. So Black childhood in particular is both unimagined and unimaginable. What do I mean by that? It's a social phenomenon. Even though we look at Black childhood as a developmental phase where they possess their own agency to impact the world and where they still see themselves as vulnerable, the effects of racism truly changes what it means to be a Black child during this period. Because it reiterates that their lives as children only matter because of who others want them to be or fear what they may become in adulthood. One of the problems is that we have created a world in which Black boys and Black girls cannot just be. Why? It's because for many Black children, they're considered inferior, they're considered dangerous, they're considered indistinguishable from Black adulthood. It's due to fears on stereotypes by other groups and parents who feel they need to protect their own children from the dangers of Black children. And as such, they deprive them of what a true childhood should be, a time of freedom and character building. But because of this fear, there's inequitable systems that are in place. And ultimately, it's led to many Black children not being afforded the same presumption of innocence in comparison to white children, especially during their play and recreational pursuits. So when we think about that, we know that Black and brown children, particularly, and children that are part of low socioeconomic status, aren't even getting access to basic PE and even free play during recess. Black parents are aware of this fact. They may be unaware of the research, but they feel it as part of the society overall. They actually fear free play and the expression of freedom and what it could entail can actually endanger them and put their children at risk. And so we hear all the time of young Black families who are saying, I want my kids to play, but I have to be careful of them playing in what may happen with other people, with the police, with people in the neighborhood. And so these realities about free play and the ability to play is significantly infringed. But there's a historical reason for that. According to Dumas and Nelson, even beginning in slavery, Black boys and girls were seen as chattel. They were property. And so even as young as 2- and 3-year-olds were put into work into the fields or into houses. And they actually suffered the same type of behavior and punishment that Black adults received. They also were rarely perceived as being worthy of even having playtime. They were severely punished for even exhibiting normal childlike behavior. And things that were actually provided to white children during childhood, such as education, reading, access to develop those skills, were actually not allowed for Black children. Uncle Tom's Cabin gives us a great example of this. If you remember the story by Harriet Beecher Stowe, there was the angelic white Eva, and who was contrasted with Topsy, who was the mischievous Black girl. Topsy was seen as ignorant, carefree, joyful, but also mischievous. They actually physically abused Topsy within the book. They actually had mental abuse where they talked about her being nothing. And so she was dehumanized as a character within the book, but that character actually came to life through the theater, through actual movies, through radio, through plays. And it's that character that actually went on throughout history as part of this dehumanization process. So the result actually led to the images that were part of the Topsy book being used as a weapon against Black children. It was transformed into a tool of domination, especially around race. After Emancipation Proclamation and before, you began to see these racist characters. That is the beginning of Pickaninnies. That's the picture that you see toward the bottom, where it says Little Pickaninnies as an actual book. But it also was used as a way to normalize viewing young Black children as dehumanized and a loss of innocence. And we saw that through marketing, through our advertising. What you see on the right-hand side of your screen is an advertisement for soap. And it's a white, beautiful young girl who has a bar of soap in her hand. Look at her clothes with shoes, dress, versus the Black character. And it has the statement, why doesn't your mama wash you with fairy soap? Because fairy soap was seen as the soap that you could use to wash yourself to become white, to become pure. So when you think about these images and how these images actually led to legal protections for white children, while the position of Black children actually remained relatively unchanged. The childhood of Black children were not only racialized, but it actually began to spread hate into the minstrel culture that became part of American society. So why is this significant? Because it pushes back against the normalization that everyone had this amazing childhood. And it demonstrates that children, particularly Black children that lived under this white structure, were not seen as human, and that white children were seen as being above Black children. We saw this throughout history. From your left-hand corner at the bottom, where there were human zoos within the US as late as the 1920s and the 1930s, with the World's Fair. These human zoos where Black and indigenous cultures were put into fenced areas, and whites could come in and actually look at them and what they were calling their natural habitat, and pay a few pennies to get food to toss to the children in these human zoos, all the way to young children being brutalized, young children being jailed as early as 14 years old. The youngest child ever on death row was 14 and was actually put on death row for being what was called a kissing case, where they kissed another white young girl, to hangings of young people, to racial intimidation, and finally could end in death in lots of different ways. So when we think about Black childhood, we need to really begin to realize that even though Black childhood is normalized by focusing on individual differences, we have to recognize that there were structural inequalities within communities in American society. And as such, we have begun to politicize from a position of power and privilege that certain children are problematic without even acknowledging their status is actually due to the oppressive conditions that actually exist. And so we do that by calling these kids at risk. And then we talk about they need resilience and grit to overcome things that white children never have to face. So it becomes part of what we call the system. That differential treatment that we talked about with Topsy and Evie even continues today. 2 separate studies were done over the past 4 years that looked at parents, teachers, and law enforcement perceptions of Black girls and Black boys. Those individuals felt that Black girls needed less nurturing, less protection. They didn't need to be comforted, that they were seen as independent, they knew more about adult topics and even knew more about sex. Those Black boys were seen as guilty of suspected crimes. They were faced with increased police violence if accused of a crime. They also viewed them as older than they actually are by overestimating them by 4.5 years. So they were seeing young Black boys that were only 10 years old, and they actually believed they were 14 or even 15 years old. And so when we think about this differential treatment, we begin to understand why there was increased surveillance of Black youth. There's an implementation of policies and laws and practices that limit their voice, that limit their agency, and there's increased regulation of their behavior within society. And we'll talk about what that looks like when we get to racialized landscapes. So let's take a moment, because I know some of those stats and things could be seen as very traumatizing. What are your thoughts at this point right now? How are you feeling about this historical overview of Black childhood? I see a lot of people are going, oh my God, in the chat, talking about a situation where a racially traumatized Black kid was offered a book about how to overcome racism. No thoughts at all about actually addressing the racism he was enduring. Exactly. And so when we think of about Black children in the outdoors, we have to recognize the trauma and the fact that we have set up a system where those who aren't participating are seen as possibly the problem. And they just don't understand why people would not want to go into the outdoors. So let's move a little forward into thinking about, well, how does Black childhood relate to nature and the outdoors and participation? Well, if we look at the historical relationship between Blacks and nature, we find that we have to first start at looking at US history. Over the past 400 years, US history can be determined as being anti-Blackness. We know this because there are structural issues that were put into place. And when we say structural, we're talking about laws, policies, mandates, etc. From enslavement to political disenfranchisement, the criminal justice system, the educational system, as well as residential and health. All of these structural systems have laws that had privilege and those who were oppressed, that had the haves and the have-nots. But it also led to cultural society ideologies that really tried to regulate Black bodies, Black representation, cultural practices, all based on things like stereotypes and myths. And Tom and Jody Block are talking about the little Black boy in Cleveland, that is Tamir Rice, who was playing with a toy gun in the outdoors at a park and was actually shot dead within 7 seconds of the police arriving on the scene. So as we begin to talk about Blacks in the outdoor, I want us to keep in the back of our head this quote by James Baldwin. The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it. History is literally present in all that we do. So what does that mean for the outdoors? We have to recognize the practice of eugenics within nature and the outdoor. Ulysses Grant talked about the fact that nature had granted to America a century ago the greatest opportunity in recorded history to produce in isolation of a continent, a powerful and racially homogeneous people, and had provided for the experiment of a pure race. This is Ulysses Grant in 1921. And so when we think about everything that we believe is part of something we feel dear, nature, trees, plants, animals, that system in and of itself actually had to do with a Eurocentric ideology that the outdoors were only for whites. They were not for Native Americans, they were not for Asians, they were not for Hispanics in the Southwest, nor were they for Blacks. That it was all about the Nordic view of race. And as such, we began to see that the prominent views of the environment still draw from some of those experiences, those nationalistic ideas, that these spaces were only for privileged few who were in a position to influence and establish legitimacy for their ideas. And this is Carol Finney, an amazing author, if you're interested, Black Faces, White Spaces, and looking at African Americans in the great outdoors. So even though we have all of these national parks, US Forest Service areas, Bureau of Land Management, all of these Army Corps of Engineers spaces and state and local spaces that should have provided access to the outdoors, we have to understand that that was not the case for so many people historically. Slavery was linked to exploitation, and Blacks at the end of slavery wanted to resist that and create their own unique ways for living on the land. Native Americans were removed from the land in order to create national parks and national forests. And as such, Native Americans as well as African Americans did not see wilderness in the same way as those who were white. Even after African Americans were emancipated post-Civil War in the South, and were supposed to get their 40 acres and a mule, they were still expected to pay for the land with wages. At the same time, free lands were given to whites via Homestead Act and other land acts. So African Americans historically with the land have not only had land taken from them, but they also bore the brunt of a lot of the environmental pollution and diseases that were in some of these areas as whites fled urban areas to go into the suburbs. The ultimate goal is understanding that nature is culturally constructed as well as culturally situated. As early as 1901, Booker T. Washington, in his book Up for Slavery, talked about the fact that he loved the outdoors. He felt it was a place of rest. It was a place where he could touch nature, but actually be around flowers, shrubs, animals, and hear the chirp of the crickets and the songs of the birds. But at the same time, he was also frightened of it because he was told at the end of Emancipation Proclamation that the first thing the armies did if they found a Negro boy was to cut off his ears. And so it was this disconnect but connection that African Americans have lived with regarding their access to lands. There's also what we call this collective memory of historical violence. Billie Holiday had a song titled Strange Fruit. How many of you remember that song? I've never heard that song. And people love that song, but most didn't necessarily understand the words that you see on your screen. The song Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday was about lynchings. And she talked about the lynchings from the tree and how those bodies swing from the tree as a type of fruit. And that here's a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rot, for the tree to drop. Here's a strange and bitter crop. So the outdoors and certain trees became a painful symbol for many Black people, that reminding them that the color of their skin could mean death, and that death ultimately ended up in forested areas. And so when we think about that collective memory of things that were passed down from generation to generation, we know that individuals felt this fear of the outdoors. But that does not mean that they didn't participate in the outdoors. We know Blacks participated, but it was an under participation compared to their white counterparts. There are two frameworks that people use to talk about that: the marginality and ethnicity framework. The marginality framework said that Black people just didn't have the economics position. They were in a marginal position, and so that's why they didn't participate. Ethnicity framework said it's about culture. It was because of that collective memory. But I'm here to tell you, to dispel all of those myths, that there were Black havens throughout the US in the outdoors. From the American Beach in Florida, to Bruce's Beach in Manhattan Beach, California, to Lincoln Hills in Colorado, Highland Beach in Maryland, to Woodland Park, to the most famous of them all, Idlewild, which was founded in 1912, and it was known as the Black Eden and was located in Lake County, Michigan. It was the largest and most famous African-American resort in the US. And it is there that individuals went to this rugged, camp-like environment to experience the outdoors. So even though most of us believe Blacks just didn't go into the outdoors, that is a myth. They did, and they did in hundreds of numbers every single year. But these are some of the sites that were lost in history. But it was also lost because of racialized landscapes. And Bruce's Beach has actually been in the news lately. The county of Los Angeles actually took Bruce's Beach from its owners in the late 1940s, 50s. I may have the date wrong, you guys. I'm putting together a whole lot of cases in my head. but they actually just voted a few months ago to return Bruce's Beach to the family. And this actually has a historical landmark now in Manhattan Beach. And so these places were always there. Research has shown that urban youth have environmental knowledge and express environmental concerns, that plants, animals, and parks are interesting, and they play an important role in many of their lives. That nature is appealing if it doesn't appear too wild. And we'll talk about that. But that there are Black groups all over the country that are reclaiming and recoloring the outdoors. They're looking at farming and gardening. They're talking about Black consciousness in nature and through spirituality, because nature has become part of the universe as part of the culture as well. And finally, I'm gonna skip this one real quick because I'm gonna run out of time, Claude. Sorry about that. I told them I talked too much. So finally, let's talk about these racialized landscapes and what they mean. So what do I mean by racialized landscapes? We have landscapes today, as well as historically, that are defined and reinforced on racial hierarchies. I'm gonna say that again. There are areas, places that are defined, and it is reinforced around racial hierarchies. And people use this to facilitate domination and exploitation. So let's take a quick look at history. During segregation, it was a racialized landscape, coloreds only, whites only, that led not only into the public, but into communities, into our national parks, into our beaches, and even into our swimming pool. And this is a famous picture where the actual motor lodge owner poured bleach into the swimming pool because Black children were inside the swimming pool. And even though we know that is historical, we have to also understand that this was done at a systematic level. Playgrounds in 1921, in Baltimore, there were almost 4,000, but only 13% of those were actually open to Black children. So does this exclusion still happen today? Yeah, it does. If we look at the typical neighborhood and their diversity, we know that most whites live in neighborhoods that are majority whites. Blacks live in neighborhoods that have a large percentage, about half and half, with a few Hispanics. Hispanics, same. Asians live mostly in neighborhoods that's majority white with a few other individuals. So why is this important? Because that neighborhood diversity actually can dictate what access, availability of resources regarding parks and the outdoors. If we look at minority centrist tracts, we know that 80% of Hispanics, 79% of Blacks, Hispanics and mixed neighborhoods, and 70% of Black neighborhoods have no recreation facilities. Only 38% of white neighborhoods have that. So there is disparity. We also know in the city of Baltimore, African-American children have less access to park acreage. For those areas in Baltimore that have over 75% white, they have about 53 acres per 1,000 people in their population. For those that are majority Black, they only have 13 acres. A strong disparity also in the availability of parks within and forested areas within the city of Baltimore. And even though that's historical, there's still some current patterns of disparities in recreation and access to the outdoors. One way this is kept up is by what we call the white gaze. It's a form of surveillance by both police and school authorities that criminalizes young bodies. Someone mentioned earlier Tamir Rice playing in a park, but it's not just in the parks. Creative Steps Summer Day Camp was actually denied access to a private pool even after they paid for their day camp to attend that, to actually participate in that pool. When the minority children got in the pool, Caucasian children were pulled immediately and told to exit. We know even this past year, Christian Cooper, a bird watcher in New York Central Park, where he had the police called on him. Ahmaud Arbery. And so we have white adults who unconsciously are biased against children of color, particularly Black children in terms of their play behavior and motivation. And it's that white gaze that gives people cultural permission to become law enforcement officers, to police children in the outdoors. And so this isn't just something that we can say was the past. The problem is, because we live in a world that encourages people to use differences to include or exclude, reward or punish, credit or discredit, elevate or oppress, value, devalue, leave alone or harass, we have to begin to address this issue. So where do we go from here? I'm going to give you 6 quick strategies that I think each of us as individuals and those of us who are part of organizations can actually use to actually overcome this Black childhood historical significance, the issue with the history of Blacks in nature and racialized landscapes. Number 1, we need to recognize historical oppression. We need to understand the historical marginalization at the individual level as well as the systemic level and how it's manifested itself in US society. A society that still can not deal with the fact that there were human zoos or that there was segregation or that we are policing and arresting in Orlando, Florida, a young girl in kindergarten for behavior issues. We have to begin to address that, to even begin to think about how do we do this to be more inclusive in the outdoors. We need to gain cultural competency at the individual level. You need to increase your awareness, gain knowledge, and acquire skills to work with Black girls and Black boys and their families. Curious Parenting is a great website which talks about how to raise anti-racist young kids and how that can actually translate into our organizations. How? Examine the organization. Be aware of the organizational culture. What is its purpose, its vision? Bernheim is an example that I love, whose vision started with, we will be open to all. So what does that mean? How do we begin to have capacity building? What are the behaviors within the organization, its norms, its practices? How do we communicate? And how do we measure and become accountable to ourselves? And then we need to take action. Look at our structures. Look and see if we have biased policies or procedures. Do we have community investment? Are we talking about kids as if they're developmental deficits that they have versus looking at them from a wholesome standpoint? The 4th thing we can do is name it and educate. Yes, I told you guys this would be uncomfortable, but a presentation like this, you have to name anti-Blackness. You have to name racism, misogynoir for what it is and include examples to actually illustrate what it looks like and how it manifests in society. And this presentation was a great example of me trying to educate each of you about this process. 5th, become an advocate and an ally for policies and programs that affirm Black girls and boys. Assist in healing from this racial trauma. Our young Black boys and girls are dealing with trauma, that collective memory. is there. We hear it, we know it. But encourage and respect inclusion in the outdoors. Talk about the fact that these are the things that happen in the outdoors, but we are going to recolor that story. And know the difference between being an ally and being an advocate. An ally usually assists and supports in current efforts. Everyone believes they can be an ally. I need individuals to be an advocate. And that's where I would challenge you. Influence by using your privilege to acknowledge and utilize it to make social and political change. And last, I love this from the 70s, say it loud and say it proud. Anti-Blackness is centered on the belief that Black girls and boys and their accomplishments are inferior. It is critical that we believe in Black excellence and that we identify it and we speak about it to these young kids. If we keep saying they don't belong in these spaces, they won't participate. If these spaces, such as the outdoors, are for all, then we need to make sure we truly believe that. And so I am going to leave it here with these 3 questions for you. Think about what you've learned today from your head. Think about how you feel with everything I've said from your heart. And then finally, think about what action you will take with your feet. Your head, your heart, your feet. And I leave you today, and I'm open for any questions or comments. Thank you guys so much for your time. And I am going to stop sharing so we can see face to face a little better.
Does anyone have questions for Corliss?
Questions. And I have questions I can ask you guys. What are you guys thinking? Too much? Mark, go for it.
Yes. First of all, you may have addressed some of this. I had to drop off because my computer died for a moment, but I'm curious about whether turning children on to nature in their own communities, in their own backyards, could be a first step in bridging that gap between the urban and the rural natural land.
I'm going to tell you yes. That was actually my dissertation. That was actually my dissertation. I'm going to say yes, start with where they are. Because one of the biggest problems in environmental education is that we take young people from their homes into the outdoors and tell them, yep, you need to love it. You need to appreciate it. And they go for that one opportunity and they go back home and they never have access again. So think about that. But you want them and you tell them they need to love it, but they can only go if someone takes them. But you don't talk about or get them to appreciate their own backyard. But here's the caveat. And this is where privilege comes in, not just white privilege, but economic privilege, travel experience privilege. When we talk about nature, we want to talk about nature based on where we have visited. So we talk about it, you know, the trees and deer, but we don't talk about it in terms of New York City, it's rats, right? There are cockroaches. And so how do you get them to understand nature within their own city? When they see flowers grow between cement and cracks in the sidewalk. And we would say, oh, that's just a weed, you need to destroy that. And so we have to get a better understanding of nature and recognizing that nature is culturally situated. And it's only if you start there that you can go to the next level. I grew up in Los Angeles. I knew those mountains were there. Y'all see the mountains. And I went there, but no, I was not going to go work there. For somebody who grew up in Los Angeles, I still have family members today in Los Angeles who are like, I'm not going camping. I don't care what you say, Corliss. I'm not going out there, because anybody I know that went out there, something happened to them. And we need to recognize those fears. So yes, I would agree with you, but that's not how our programs work. Most of us want to say, from our privileged standpoint, that's not nature. That's not environment. Who wants to talk about a cockroach? Who wants to talk about water that may be brown?
Corliss, just so you know, when I was a graduate student, I did a published paper on cockroach and house mouse interactions. So I love them.
I love them. That's what I'm saying. How to talk about them.
I hadn't heard that one before, Mark.
But I think that's a problem with our environmental movement as well, is that we come from such a higher level, and that we believe that these are the spaces that minority groups and low economic groups have to love, because we love it. How could you not love the forest? How could you not love the desert without understanding, I've never been to a desert. How am I going to love something I've never been to?
Corliss, I have a question.
Yeah.
A lot of efforts to kind of bridge this nature divide start with older youth, teens, like the Outward Bound and those kinds of things. That seems like a possibility, but a difficult one, because you're kind of starting late in the game.
Right.
Can you talk about bridging this gap and with our youngest children?
Right. One of the best things that I've been an advocate for is environmental education programs in the school setting. There's some amazing school districts who are doing this. For example, Houston ISD, where in the 4th grade of elementary school, you have to attend what they have at a district-wide environmental camp. So every single student in that grade goes throughout that year for several days. And so they're starting at a much younger age and doing it within the school system. So I believe that, yes, you do need to start much earlier. You can start as early as preschool, and there are some daycare programs that are now starting to incorporate environmental education and environmental design within their day-to-day experiences in the outdoors. The problem with starting at a youth age, so say 14, 15, 16, is that they're already set in a lot of their ways. At that point, they're already involved in what we call structured activities. So the sports, the bands, the art, and they don't want to take an additional activity to add on to it. It's also a reason why park districts are starting to do family programming, where they are providing tents, they're providing the sleepers free of charge to do overnight camps within the local parks as a family. For most of us who are actually involved in outdoor education or love the outdoors, they were socialized into it through their families. It was part of family activities. It was something they did annually. That's not the case for all families. And so how do you begin to incorporate the ideas of the outdoors through not just the children, but the parents as well? It's all about the parents at the younger age as well. And a lot of times our programs don't want to think about, they're like, oh no, we're just going to pay for the kids to go. And you wonder why it doesn't stick, because it's not something that's also encouraged by the parents. And for African Americans, most of the time the parents weren't involved in the outdoors either. So I can tell you now, I am considered an outsider in my family. when it comes to the outdoors, because my parents just didn't do that. My brothers and sisters still don't do that. I take that back, my brother does. I went into forestry and he went to forestry 5 years later. But now he doesn't work in forestry, so I guess it's over. But he's a Boy Scout leader, so I guess I'll take that too. So I do think programs should start much younger. The other thing that we're starting to see is not only programs in parks, but in churches, barbershops, hairstylist salon, to try to look at it to be culturally relevant. So not just trying to recruit through your normal ways like, oh, I know somebody, Boys and Girls Club, but really trying to get ingrained within the community that represents that particular culture.
Mark,
go for it.
I don't want to, if there's others, please. At Bernheim, we're working hard to diversify our staff. It is a shortfall that we have that many environmental outdoor organizations have. That's not an excuse, it's a fact. And we're working hard to kind of grow our own source of excited kids and young adults and of diverse backgrounds to fill those jobs and get in these careers. I'm going to ask you a question I think I know the exact answer to, but Corliss, how important is it for people to see people like themselves in the outdoors? Very.
When Claude introduced me, he told you I was the first to get forestry degree at Southern Illinois. I was the first at Texas A&M. And I will tell you that was only 20 years ago. My PhD is from 2000, and I was the first. At Texas A&M as a faculty member, I have been the one and only Black female as a faculty member at Texas A&M, with the exception of 2 years where Dr. Brandy Kelly Pryor, who's now in Louisville, she was my former student, my PhD student. We hired her immediately afterwards, and you guys stole her to Louisville. We had her for 2 years, and it was then 2 of us. I was one of only 3 in an entire college at Texas A&M, in the College of Ag. And so it's very important. But I'm going to challenge you, Mark, so just take this. When organizations, particularly environmental organizations that are predominantly white, tell us in terms of individuals of color that we can't find people to be on staff, we say you're the problem. Because there are plenty of environmental activists, individuals involved in the environment that are of racial and ethnic groups. There are local, state, and national environmental organizations that are predominantly minority. There are 100 historically Black colleges and universities. Right. And of those, approximately 50 have colleges of agriculture and natural resources that have graduates in everything from plant biology to agricultural engineering. The issue is you keep looking in the same spaces. And those spaces are usually already racialized spaces. Right. So in other words, you'll say, hey, we need someone. Well, they're not coming to Bernheim, right? But they're not coming to Bernheim because, one, they don't even know about it. Sorry, but they don't know about it, right? Right. But then you're like, but we can't find them. But there are national conferences. MANRS, MANRRS, is Minorities in Agriculture, Natural Resources, and Related Sciences. They are a national organization made up of agricultural universities and chapters at all of their campuses. You can recruit there. There used to be MINFORS, Minorities in Forestry, and related sciences. There is Outdoor Afro. There is the Black Brotherhood of Ski Association. There is a National Hispanic Environmental Organization that puts on a conference every single year. So there's national organizations where individuals can recruit from. There are also magnet schools that are strictly agriculture and environmental focused. So the individuals are out there. Are they in mass numbers? No, but they're out there. It's doing a better job of recruiting. And a lot of times it's not about the recruitment, it's about the retention.
I will acknowledge that issue, say we're working on it, and I will acknowledge that there are great people out there that we need to find.
Yeah,
so,
and this isn't just for your group. I mean, we've talked with the Sierra Club, we've talked with John Muir, we've had these conversations. We're like, we can't find people, but I can tell you that the students that I'm familiar with, sometimes they don't come because they know you only want them for your annual report to say that you did something.
Yes.
And I can tell for a fact, because I have colleagues who will call my former students who are mostly minorities with PhDs and ask them to apply for a faculty position, when they already know they have someone else in mind for that position, but they need to add someone, a diversity applicant, for their numbers. And the same thing happens for environmental organizations, which is why I'd say it's a lot about how you recruit and retention, because sometimes you get into these spaces and they say, yes, we're anti-Black. Yes, we want to do diversity and inclusion. And half of your staff can be racist and they're microaggressions, or the policies are racist. And so, and the practices where you're sitting around talking about, yeah, we want to develop this program, but we don't want kids from that side of the town. Or we're not going to go into that neighborhood because there's some high crime rates. It comes across that you're not dedicated. And so they're just things that we can work on together to overcome some of these barriers, and also talk about how to make it, how to change. That's the best way, how to do change, not only within organizations, but within the community as well. And I know each of you can tell a story about a community organization in the outdoors you've worked with where you heard prejudicial, stereotype, or racist comments.
Right, right.
And at the same time, someone says, but we need more minorities. And we're sitting there like, I'm not sending my kids to your organization and then say they can go into the outdoors overnight and I'm not sure what's going to happen to them. Are you truly going to protect my Black and brown children if KKK showed up? If someone said something to them, are you truly going to protect them? And that's a question a lot of people don't want to have to answer because it means being accountable. I try to give hard truths. I'm sorry, Mark.
No, that's good.
I wouldn't have asked if I didn't expect some of that, and we'll admit to a bunch of that, and we're working on it. And
just keep working.
It's you know, I look forward to picking your brain in the future as well.
We can do that. Just keep. I say just keep working. There's some really good programs and some policies and practices from other organizations I definitely can throw your way. And I could throw it to Claude to make some connections for you guys.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions?
Carolyn, you had your hand up earlier. Do you have a question?
Yeah, and it tags off of the one that Mark asked. So thank you for asking that, Mark. I wonder about, I think a lot of us are familiar with this idea that we're working in predominantly white organizations that were founded by white people and based in white culture. And how much of our energy should we be putting towards trying to diversify and change worldviews within an organization versus focusing those energies outside of the organization where there's already great work being done by Black-led organizations or people of color.
So those are the differences between an ally and advocate in some ways. So an ally can actually be parallel, right? But an advocate is saying we want to change society or policies overall. And so working to dismantle some of those structural issues is where I've been putting my energy, right? Because a lot of times you're not going to be able to change those individual minds, but we can change some of those systems that actually exist. So I've been putting my energy in those systems and doing organizational change. Because this is the key why. When we look at, I don't know if you guys remember Brofenbrenner ecological model, and the kid is in the middle. And then there's circles, which includes the parents, the schools. And then there's another circle that includes the parents and where they work, where they interact within communities, and then communities interact at the larger circle, and then society at whole. We have a bigger impact at impacting society at that organizational and those interactions of the systems. If we can make change there, we can impact what happens at the individual level. So if we can change schools, right? And what kids need to learn, environmental education, it's going to already impact the young person. If we can get rid of some of that trauma with policing, then I would feel better for my kids to go around the corner to the local park. I would feel better about going outdoors. I would feel better about my kids being able to ride the bike more than 2 blocks if I can just fix policing. So that's what I mean by that. If I can fix policing to actually arrest and find the Karens, sorry anybody named Karen, the Karens who are calling the police on young kids just playing, just being, then if they know they're going to get fined, they won't call. But right now they know they have the privilege to even place a call and nothing will happen to them. So Carolyn, I would say work with those other organizations and put efforts, those other minority organizations, and put efforts in changing the system. That doesn't mean you can't do programming. That doesn't mean you don't do stuff for kids, but it's at this higher level that would change what we truly want, and that's access for all. And I love Mark because he just keeps putting up his thumbs like, yes. So thank you for that question, because that's one that a lot of people ask. Well, where should we put our emphasis? And Catherine just said over-policing of kids of color is a fact and it's happening at schools. Yes, disciplinary issues are happening at school. And this is the thing to think about also, those disciplinary issues, what do they take away? When you get in trouble, what's the first thing they take away? Play. That's what they take away. So how do we come up with a different alternative system? Because play is what they need to learn. Y'all can tell I'm just an advocate for so much.
Well, thank you for helping us advocate for things like play. So,
yeah. Anything else? I know it's a lot and some of it was heavy, but one of the biggest things I want to say is that larger issue impacts what we do. Megan.
Yeah, I had a quick question, and it's more like a mental health question for us. So I work at an organization that has not seen the light, I dare say. But I love all the stuff you guys are doing. I try to implement it as much as I can in my own program that I do. But sometimes I just get so discouraged. You know, I'm trying to work within my organization and change what I can. and then also reach out to other individuals throughout the community, like you were talking about, to affect system change. But do you have any tips for what you do when you just feel like you're pushing the biggest boulder up a hill and not making much progress?
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about organizational capacity building and organizational readiness. It sounds like your organization is not ready for change. She's like, no. So some of the things to do is, yes, educate yourself, get the knowledge and skills that you need to be anti-racist in lots of ways. The other thing is to push for policies. So when you're in a meeting and they're saying, hey, we think we need to do X, Y, Z, make sure those policies are anti-racist in form, that they're inclusive. And that's where you can push. Also for practices. What do I mean by practices? How do they deal with people when they just walk through the door? How do we go about sending out invitations for something like this, right? The basic practices. Are we being inclusive? And that inclusion needs to look outside the box. Play Cousins is amazing, but what are we doing outside of Play Cousins? And Play Cousins knows I love them. I'm just using them as an example. But what are we doing outside of Play Cousins? Are we doing that mom and pop program? Are we building relationships? Talk with your advisory board. Know your policies in and out. The other thing that I can tell you is find other allies within the organization. That is always the hardest thing. Sometimes it's very hard to go out on your own, but when it's 2 or 3 of you saying it, it actually has more weight. And some people on the screen may not like me saying this, but also the funders and the advisory board. Become good friends with them. We also know that there are gatekeepers in organizations that tell you you can't talk to the advisory board members. Sorry, Cadell. But
yeah, it's fine. We're an open organization.
Good. So sometimes this is good, is to talk to those advisory board members or the funders who are funding. People talk and make change when money is involved. Mm-hmm. So those are just some quick thoughts on that. I do have some more about staff recruitment, how to build a safer environment that I can send to Claude and have him send this presentation out along with some of those resources. I can do that. Thanks that's a good question, actually.
Well, let's,
hey,
Josh has a question.
Josh, go for it.
Yeah, I've got a question. I'm wondering, what kind of role do you think it plays in regards to a lack of knowledge regarding African culture and how Africans have lived historically? What kind of role do you think that plays, even looking at an identity issue all at the same time?
Yeah. I would say that's an area that we've been looking at for a long time in terms of research, is what is the true African-American culture? And for some people, it's the Black culture. How many and how much of our African roots have we actually kept as part of our transition here through slavery or being enslaved to today? The lack of historical understanding of who we are. Sorry, you guys, I'm talking to Josh directly. The lack of understanding of who we are as Black Americans does have a tremendous impact on our connection to nature. And we've seen that through generations and the loss of over 90% of Black-owned farms in America since Emancipation Proclamation. But that is also based on issues around structure, about the laws that when we have tried to connect to our roots, we've lost everything. Anything that has allowed us to connect to those roots, to understand Black prosperity, to understand self-fulfilling prophecies around having our own towns, having our own insurance, having our own businesses, having our own communities, that we've lost a lot of that because of civil rights. That doesn't mean civil rights was not needed, but without the segregation, we've lost our community in lots of ways. And there's several books that talk about that. So Joss, one thing that we're doing working with Claude is a rites of passage program. And that rites of passage program for young youth is to not only talk about nature and environment, but the historical connection from Africa till now, to talk about how that is part of our identity. And I may have gone through it too fast in the presentation, but that's what you're seeing with this resurgence of Blacks in gardening. So there's some amazing Black gardening groups on Facebook that have thousands of people in them. Black in the outdoors, Blacks in travel. We're trying to reconnect, and that's what I'm seeing now. And we're trying to figure out how to start researching information on why they're reconnecting and what that means for their own identity. So it's a new area of research, but I do think you're correct. Some of it has to do with the loss of who we are. And for most white Americans, they don't get that. I can trace back to early 1800s for my family, but by 1810, I am white in terms of my family history on my mom's side. So how do we trace back further when it's all lost in slave records and you were bought and sold as property? So I'm thinking, Joshua, we're going down that line as well. Is that where you're going?
Yes. And, and just in, when I read, particular books, that may have, maybe they're anthropology or sociology books that are, that were done maybe in the 30s or 40s, and they're exploring, different places in Africa and looking at the social systems and looking at, how a lot of these folks were essentially experts when it came to outdoors, whether it's, understanding barks on trees, or, even the medicines from the, from the different, weeds or flowers or plants, or, even hunting, whereas, let's say for me growing up, it was, Black people don't hunt, and, Black people don't swim or, get in the water and do boats, or, Black people don't do all these things. So it's almost been that we've never done these things when that's not the reality, where folks were experts when it came to outdoors in general, whether play or agriculture or what have you.
So there are several books you may be interested in. Ivan Van Sertima, They Came Before Columbus. He's also has a book on African roots of different agricultures. I'm trying to put it in the chat at the same time I'm talking. Of agriculture that was transferred from countries in Africa into the US, and what that meant for the US agricultural system being developed by Black Americans. Booker T. Washington, Up From Slavery, some of his books, W.B. Du Bois, Philadelphia Negro, The Souls of Black Folks are good books. And then some more current ones are around Racialized Landscapes, and Environmental Thought is another one. I just give you a list. There's a whole lot of them that that can provide you guys. I'll just put a list together and put it at the end of the presentation today when I send it to Klaus. That'll give you guys some more historical understanding of the connection, which is why I said there is a connection. It's just it's been whitewashed and we don't talk about it. Yeah. Claude, I know we're out of time. I'm sorry.
Don't be. It's a great conversation, and obviously we're not at the end of it. So but we're at the end of tonight. So thank you very much for coming and being a part of this. And thanks to everybody that was on this program tonight. And obviously we need to do more. So we'll do more.
We'll do more. And I wouldn't even say do more, just do what you do better and more inclusive. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's just focus on what you're doing and make sure it's inclusive.
Thank you.
So
And we're
thank you,
very
guys.
thankful to have you as a partner too. So thank you for your.
So please join me, everyone, in giving Corliss a big round of applause and everybody here. And everybody
All right.
enjoy your evening. So
Have a great
thank
evening,
you
you guys.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.